Today, Liz is going to talk about open source tools, technologies, and best practices. Liz Joseph is a developer advocate at Mesosphere, where she focuses on the Apache Mesos and DC OS communities. Previously, she spent 4 years as a systems engineer on the OpenStack Infrastructure team and 6 years on the Ubuntu Community Council. She's the author of Common OpenStack Deployments and the official Ubuntu book, 8th and 9th editions. At home in the San Francisco Bay Area, she sits on the board of directors for Partimus, a nonprofit providing Linux-based computers to learning facilities in need. Please welcome Liz Joseph.
Thank you. Okay, so I came here to talk to you about contributing to open source. So I first want to ask, who has contributed to open source before? Okay, who's done a lot of contributing to open source?
You got to speak into this because we can barely hear you.
Okay, so contributing to open source. How many of you want to contribute but are not sure where to start? There's a few, okay. All right, so this talk will be aimed at people who want to learn more about contributing and people who are looking for where to start, because I'm going to start really, really basic here. The talk that we heard this morning was actually really good because her number 3 recommendation was contributing to open source. So I'm going to touch upon doing this as your job and also as a hobbyist, which I've done both. So Rupa already introduced me, so you don't need to know much more. I am a developer advocate these days, but I came out of systems engineering, and that's how I can do stuff on Mesos and DCOS and all these infrastructure projects that I'm working on, because that's my technical background, even though I go to conferences and talk a lot these days. But as she mentioned, I also spent 6 years on the Ubuntu Community Council. Of course, Ubuntu is a Linux distribution. I'm running it on this laptop, and I was so happy when the projector worked. It usually works. I was just nervous after Gloria's presentation this morning where the wasn't working. But I've been doing Linux involvement. I've been involved with Linux for a really long time. I actually moved out here from Philadelphia, where I ran the Philadelphia LinuxChix chapter, which we started back in like 2002. I started contributing to Debian, another Linux distribution that Ubuntu is based off of, around 2006. And then I spent 6 years working at a small tech services provider in Philadelphia. We were servicing like some of the museums in the area, a shipyard that's in the area, and a few other big customers. So I got my Linux engineering cred in there, and I started contributing to open source software while I was working at that job. So I've been in open source spaces for, okay, now that's like 17 years, so long time. And I've worked on projects all over the map. I really wanted to learn how to cook at one point, and I have always failed at learning how to cook. So I decided to join an open source project that is about cooking. So that didn't work either. But I got to work on an open source project that was about a recipe management. So I've done all kinds of projects, and then I worked on OpenStack and was doing it for my job. And then, of course, working at Mesosphere, working on Apache Mesos and DCOS. So I wanted to start off just by going through some of the tools that you're going to have to be familiar with when you start approaching an open source software project. The key thing to think and keep in mind is that people who contribute to open source typically are not working in an office together. They also may not work for the same company. They may not be in the same country. When I was working on OpenStack, I was working with people all over the world from dozens of different major companies. I was at HP. My immediate colleagues were from Red Hat and IBM. And these are the people I worked with every day. If I went to the HP office, I didn't know anyone. I was working mostly with people from other companies. So what open source tools need to do is connect the people who are working at different companies, working through different time zones, working in different areas, and allow them to collaborate. So one of the first things they need to do is be on some sort of mailing list so that people can be connected in that way. I took a picture, I took a screenshot of this because when I first started getting involved in open source software, I got to my first mailman mailing list entry page, and I was like, this is scary and ugly, and I don't want to put my email address in there. But it is like the de facto standard for open source projects is Mailman. There is a new version of Mailman out that has lots of nice, pretty skins, and the UI looks really nice, but no one uses them. So this is what you're going to encounter half the time when you go to an open source project and want to join their mailing list. This is the one for Ubuntu users. You know, Ubuntu is like the de facto desktop for Linux for people wanting to try it out. And this is the page they come to when they want to jump on the mailing list and learn how to use their system. Another one that a lot of organizations, open source project use is Google Groups. This is just a screenshot from the one I'm working on now, DCOS. The great thing about Google Groups is one, that it's a little prettier than the old Man one. Unfortunately, it's proprietary, whereas Mailman is an open source project. So I don't really love that aspect, and it's controlled by Google, so if Google decides to shut down these mailing lists, we won't have them anymore, and that would be very sad. But what it does, it integrates a mailing list and a forum, sort of, so you can reply and view messages in the web UI, or you can just do it via email. Since I'm coming from the world of just doing regular mailing lists, I never look at this. I actually had to look up how to find this UI, because I didn't really remember. So you can reply online or just do it through email. And that's really helpful for a lot of new contributors. You still have to sign up, but then you can reply through this instead of writing emails and worrying about formatting, which is sometimes an issue. So once you've got mailing lists behind you, the next way you want to contribute, you want to get a hold of each other is through a chat. So mailing lists tend to be used for these long discussions and detailed discussions. Chat is more like you're doing a one-off, or you just need to hash out something with someone really quick. There's a lot of support that's done on chat. And so you might have heard of IRC, Internet Relay Chat. This is just one of the many graphical interfaces for it. But what you do is you connect to a server that is running. The most common one from open source project is called Freenode. So this is the OpenStack Infrastructure channel on the Freenode network. And these are people just in the channel talking about running the infrastructure for the OpenStack project. It's not super pretty. It doesn't have history. So when you load up your client, when you connect, that is when you start seeing messages for the day. A lot of people have tried to get around this by running log servers, where you can go and see the logs from the past day. What a lot of us do when we get really involved in open source, we just start running something on one of our servers, so we never turn off our IRC client. So there's a few mechanisms for making it easier, but one of the things that caused IRC, I think, to not be quite as popular in recent years was because it lacks that history, and you can't really see what's going on when you're not there. So you close your laptop, it disconnects from the internet, and then you lose anything that's happening in the chat room. So a lot of projects has also gone to using Slack. Again, IRC, there's a lot of open source implementations. Slack is, again, proprietary, just like with the Google Groups. So I think it's an unfortunate trend, because now open source projects have to use their UI and have to use all of their tooling in order to work in their project. But it is where we are. There's history in the Slack, which is really nice, so you can scroll through it. I think a lot of us are using it at work, right? Yeah, so you're already familiar with the interface. But if you look at it, they're actually very similar. You've got a user list on one side of the screen, and then the chat room in the middle. In IRC here, there's actually like a channel listing at the top, so it's hard to see, but you can see there's Ubuntu and OpenInfra. And then here, there's the channel listing down the other side. So they're both chat systems, and they have a lot of similarities. It's just a different way of getting there. So once you have communicating squared away, you've got mailing lists and chat, the next thing you want to look into is where you're actually going to put your code. So this is where we get into revision control. And a lot of people are already using it at work, so there's a lot of familiarity there. Git is pretty much the de facto revision control system for open source projects these days, but you'll still run into a few, especially like if you're working on anywhere in the Ubuntu space. There's one called Bazaar, BZR, which was used a lot in some of that community. SVN was really popular. Don't tell my husband I told you this, but he uses like an SVN to Git command because he's so used to SVN. I was like, you have to learn Git. He's like, I'm not doing that. So anyway, so if you're familiar with SVN, there actually are tools out there if you are really afraid of learning Git. And these are actually just the revision control system themselves. So these are open source tools that you're able to use to manage your code. What they are then done, what you then do is find a hosting platform. So Git itself comes with a little web UI that's really ugly and nobody uses it. So usually you want to have some sort of UI, and that is where GitHub comes in. So GitHub and Git are different things. GitHub is a code hosting platform, and Git is the software that you're using and they're running on it. And if you look at these hosting platforms, they all have a lot of things in common. So this is GitHub. It shows you your code. It shows you when people want to merge things. And it shows you just different views of the project. So this is a Git project on GitHub. This is a Git project on cgit. Cgit is what the OpenStack project uses for code browsing. So you have this very similar things. You can see a summary, you can see the tree of code, and you can traverse through this. In the case of cgit, it is only a display mechanism. It is not an interactive experience like you have with GitHub, because with GitHub you can actually submit changes and such. With something like cgit, it's actually view only, and so you can view the code and download the code. This is where you clone your repository from to get the code. And then you have something like BZR on the Launchpad platform. Again, you can see your code listing. And a lot of open source projects, this is actually the marketing team's repository for the Ubuntu Linux distribution. We put all of our marketing material into revision control because those of us on the marketing team aren't really marketers. They just told me to be the marketing person because I know Twitter. And I'm like, we're going to put all our stuff in revision control. So that's how that ended up. But so it's not code actually here, but it's the same idea and it's the same sort of stuff. So if you look back at all of these, they're all very similar. They're just code platforms for various revision control systems. And of course, GitHub is the most popular, but there are other ones out there. GitLab is it's kind of an open source implementation of GitHub. So you can run if you wanted to run your own GitHub, you can run software called GitLab, and it allows you to interact through the web UI and run a platform there. So we've got our code taken care of. Everyone can collaborate using the code system there. So the next thing we want to get to is bug tracking. So there's lots of bug tracking software out there. We use Jira at work. Jira is a very popular proprietary tool for that now. But if you're looking at open source projects, some of them use Jira. Like I work on DCOS, we're using Jira for all of our bug tracking and feature tracking. But then you have things like Bugzilla, which is an old open source project that you'll actually see on a lot of the Red Hat projects. They're using a lot of Bugzilla, and there are a few other projects that are still using it pretty extensively. A lot of the projects on GitHub use the built-in GitHub issues. So those are just built into the UI there. So when someone finds a problem with the code, they don't have to go to a separate bug tracker. They can do everything on GitHub. GitLab, similarly, since it's sort of a very similar thing to GitHub, they also have their own issues. And then Launchpad has this bug system. That's what the OpenStack project actually uses. So OpenStack keeps their code in cgit. They have a bug tracker on Launchpad. And then we decided in the OpenStack project to write our own bug tracker, which is something you'll see around sometimes too. Because whenever a bug tracker doesn't work for you, obviously the answer is to write your own. So this has predictably been going on for about 4 years now, and we still don't use it. So I wouldn't recommend that. But I will say that you often run into these weird, like cobbled together bug trackers because a lot of projects think it's a really good idea to write their own. And in some cases it works. One of the reasons that OpenStack uses Launchpad is because Launchpad allows you to tag multiple projects in a bug. And OpenStack is very complicated. So it's actually really valuable to be able to show that relationship in a bug. And that's harder to do with some of these other systems. But yeah, there's like dozens, hundreds probably of bug trackers out there. But if we just look at this one, this is a bug that's still open. I messed up my SSL certificates on my server and haven't had time to fix them. So someone submitted a bug against my project. Okay, sorry, because I run this website that's actually an open source website about open source projects. But anyway, just for an example, like all bug tracking systems pretty much have the same thing. They have someone who gets assigned to it. There's probably a due date. And of course, working in a team at your company, you probably have a bug tracker. It's pretty much the same in open source. So those are the tools you're going to need to know about when you start getting involved. And oftentimes these all have different logins too. So part of the fun of joining an open source project that's not just on GitHub is getting all of your accounts in order. So you sign up for the mailing list, you get your chat account, you get your account on whatever coding platform that exists. Maybe you get an account on the bug tracker. And so getting all those in line is kind of a big task. And I hadn't joined an open source project in a few years after working on OpenStack for 4 years. So when I joined the Mesos community, I was really surprised at how many things I had to sign up for. And that's unfortunate, but a lot of these, they're just not very well integrated. So you do end up having to sign up for all these accounts. And I'll talk a little bit about your identity on those in a minute. But I want to talk a bit about techniques when you start joining these projects. I'm not going to go too deeply into getting started, but I do want to say most open source projects will have something like a getting involved page or a contribute page or a community page. In the case of Apache Mesos, there's this community page. It'll show you all the mailing lists. This one actually shows you local user groups if you're looking to get help locally. There's a contribute link, which then links to all of the resources like the code repository and the bug tracker and all that stuff. So you're able to get all of this information on one page. In GitHub repositories, sometimes that's in the README of the project, so you just want to scroll down in the project and see if there's a way, either a link to a contribute page or if the contribution information is right in there. That's actually one of the things I'm working on right now in the company that I work for, is we're trying to standardize our READMEs so that all of our projects have a way to contribute, because right now they're just like, we threw the code up there, people can just contribute, and I'm like, you actually have to give them instructions and explain to them about the project, so it should be in the README or some sort of contribute area. If you can't find out how to contribute, I'd say that's a bit of a red flag, because it may be that the project is not really able to welcome new contributors or don't really have the machinery in place to do that. So if you can't find it, you can try asking, maybe in the chat channel, how do I contribute to this project? But just be careful, because they may not be prepared to accept contributions from people they don't already know. Possibly because they're just too busy, not really out of any malice, I'm sure. And then talking about etiquette. So open source projects are communities of people, and there are rules in place for things like contributions. I have one guy actually this morning, he was one of the people who works on XFCE, which is the desktop environment that I'm working on my computer here. And he said he just filed an email from someone who wanted to contribute, who emailed him, the leader of the project, with some ideas and a patch. He said that had been sitting in his inbox for 2 years. The file that the guy was referencing, the code, has been rewritten twice, and he never replied to the email. And what happened there is this contributor, instead of going through the process of contributing and like submitting a patch or engaging with us somehow on chat or something, they just emailed the patch to the project owner. The project owner's a really nice guy, so he's like, I'm totally gonna get to this. But he didn't have time. And so in the meantime, other people have been fixing this file, going through the regular contribution method. But his patch was just sitting there in this guy's inbox. And he's like, I feel so bad for not replying. And I'm like, well, if you don't have time to go through for everyone to email you personally about changes to the project. So first, follow the rules in place for contributions. Because it may not be that the leader of the project doesn't like you and is ignoring you. They're busy, and your email may sit for 2 years. In the meantime, the project is moving on without you. Another thing is people approach open source projects, and they're like, these are all volunteers, we can all do whatever we want, and I don't have to follow through with my commitments or whatever. But it's not really like that. Increasingly, people are being paid to work on open source projects, and it's growing to be a more professional environment. So always in your interactions, be polite, act professionally. And especially if you're contributing on behalf of your company, you end up being a representative of your company in that community. And so if you're acting poorly, people may say, I don't want to deal with people in that company anymore. Their developers are mean. Another thing you want to do is provide timely and clear responses to contributions. And this is on both sides. Whether you contributed something and then they've asked for a follow-up, or if you're running an open source project and people are coming to you and asking you questions in your forums and mailing lists and things. One of the things that I see happen a lot is that someone will submit a bug report or a feature request or a patch. You'll get one of the engineers looking at it on the project. They'll say, I don't know how to fix that. I have to ask someone else, or let me think about that. And they do this all in their head. They don't communicate any of this in their bug report. And so the person submitting the bug thinks that no one is looking at the contribution, no one is looking at their stuff, and they're sad, and they lose interest and wander off. So what you always want to do is follow up in the bug report. If you think in your head, I need to ask someone about this, or I'm not really sure and I have to think about this, write that in the bug report, or write that in the pull request. If you submit a bug and they follow up and ask you more questions, respond to those questions. There's so many people who submit bugs and then disappear forever. And those bugs are useless because they're probably not crafted in a very good way and we had questions about them. And then finally, if there is a code of conduct for the project, you should read it. And any other etiquette guidelines that the project has published. Again, these are communities of people. They have these rules in place and ideas of what they want their community to look like. So understanding their etiquette guidelines and their code of conduct and being aware of what the ideals of this community are is really valuable. Another thing I want to say is have patience. While I am instructing you to be clear and follow up, not everyone does that. So sometimes your patch will sit there for a couple of months. It's perfectly okay to send like a friendly follow-up. On one of the projects I work on, the team that manages that is super busy all the time. So we see people jump in our Slack channel and say, hey, can you review my patch? It's been sitting there for 8 days. And they're like, oh yeah, sorry. So it's fine to do some friendly follow-ups here and there, but in general, just exercise patience when you do a contribution, because sometimes people are just busy, or sometimes your patch is not in alignment with what they're doing at the moment, and so they have to take some time to come back. In a perfect world, they would tell you that, but it doesn't always happen that way. Another thing sort of related to patience is that you're joining a community that you're not really familiar with yet. So if someone pauses to correct you about something you did wrong, don't take that personally. I mean, I did at first. I was like, oh, I messed that up. They hate me now. But the fact that someone corrected me and told me, they want you to be part of the community, and they want you to be an effective communicator, and they want you to be part of the project. So if they come and correct you, just say, oh, I'm sorry, and just be gracious and move on, because they're doing that because they care, and they want you to act in a certain way in order to be involved with the project. I'm so glad that the speaker this morning talked about licenses, because now I don't have to talk about them quite as much. But licenses, as she said earlier, they're incredibly important in the open source world. You really want to have a basic understanding of what these licenses are. So these permissive licenses are the ones that are most acceptable to companies. The Apache license, the MIT license, and the BSD license. Our legal team actually lists these out specifically. They tell our engineers, if you're looking to incorporate some software into our product, you can use Apache, MIT, or BSD. That's fine. You cannot use the GPL, the AGPL, which I say is sad, because the AGPL and the GPL encourage sharing of software, and that is what I really believe in. But companies do have secret sauce, and the requirements around the GPL can be complicated for a lot of companies. And these are more copyleft licenses, we heard this morning. So we actually have this list inside of our company say, yes, these, no, these, anything else, ask us. Because there's all kinds of crazy licenses out there, and these are the ones that have actually been looked over by lawyers and are ones that are common in the open source communities. You have all sorts of crazy licenses out there, licenses that have addendums, some of which don't make sense and aren't allowed, but people just make stuff up. So you want to stick to these major licenses and then ask your company what ones you're allowed to contribute to on the project. So look for a license file when you go to contribute. And then the last thing in this section is this, there's this language in open source. There's all these terms and all these things. When I first started learning about GitHub, I'm like, what is a pull request? That's such a weird term. I was working on Ubuntu, and we called them merge proposals. And that makes a lot more sense to me. But pull request it's a very strange term. So there's all kinds of these things that are just sort of part of the culture. And just like in your industry or in your field of engineering, your technical specialization, you have your own terms. Open source does as well. So you're going to have to start to get used to these things. And you can ask people what something means. People are pretty friendly in open source communities. Or you can do a Google search, because most of this stuff is Googleable. If you don't understand something, you can figure out what it is by doing a search. But just be aware that when you go into this, like, you're not stupid. It's just they have their own language, and they don't really think about new people all the time. So, and I'm certainly guilty of it myself, going off and talking. I'm sure in this talk even, I've said things you don't understand and I didn't know. So there are all this language in open source. You have to understand the terminology. So the last section of this talk is just some best practices. And the one I wanted to start off by is talking about identity. So when I started working in open source, what job did I have? I think I was working as a temp or something, a temp agency. I was doing the data entry, but I really like computers. So in my evenings and weekends, I was playing with open source software. So I was just purely the definition of hobbyist. I didn't even think I could do this for work. It's pretty cool that I can. But I was really a hobbyist. I used my personal address for everything. That's how everyone knew me, is my liz@princessleia.com. That is my email address, and that's how everyone knew me in the industry. And so my hobbyist, I was participating in a hobbyist. I didn't have a job in the industry, so I obviously used my own email address. But as I got deeper into it and actually got hired to do open source software, I actually had to ask myself a few questions. Like, now that I'm working and being paid to do this, do I want the open source work I'm doing for my job mixed with what I'm doing for my hobby? Do I want the recipe manager next to my OpenStack work? And that's a question you have to ask yourself. In my case, the answer was yes. I want all of my crazy open source stuff all mingled together so people can see what I've been working on throughout my career, regardless of when I was doing it. And you also have to ask yourself if you're interested in a presence that outlives your company. If you're getting involved with open source because it's part of your job today and you don't really have interest in it, that's okay. And you can use your work email address and then move on from there. But it can be really frustrating when you use your work email address and then you change companies and then you have to tell everyone your new address and people are still sending it to the old address and you feel like you lost all this continuity. Plus you signed up for all those bug tracking systems and mailing lists and everything with your old work address and you're like, I need to start over. But you also need to ask if you're allowed to do that. Some companies actually require you to use the company email address for your open source contributions with that company, which I think is very unfortunate, but it happens. But this JSON snippet over here is from the OpenStack project. They allow you to define what company you're invested with, regardless of what your email address is. So I was able to show that I was working for HP, and then I was working for HPE because the company split, and now I'm just independent. Because any of the contributions I make now, they're not on behalf of Mesosphere, they're just by myself. I'm probably working on something related to my book or something that's not related to my day job. So they actually allowed for a mechanism to show what company you're representing. This actually goes into their statistics system, so you can see online which companies are the big contributors to OpenStack. I wish more open source projects would do this because it allows you to more easily manage your identity. But these are just things to think about as you start getting involved. Another thing I wanted to touch upon is how to write a good bug report. So the whole point of a bug report is you want to get something fixed. And so you need to be able to give instructions to allow someone to replicate the exact same problem that you have so they can write a fix for it. So you need to include things like the version of the software that you're running, because there's lots of versions out there, and some people run really old ones and report bugs, but they're not really applicable anymore because the software is older. This happens a lot in Linux distributions where they have older packages in the software centers, in the packaging repositories. So share what software version you're using, and then give step-by-step instructions of what you did to cause the problem. Like, I clicked on this button and put in this text, and then it crashed on me. It's probably not what you want to happen, but if you can explain what you did, it goes a long way to help them replicate exactly what happened. And then you want to share what the outcome you wanted. Like in the case of a crash, you wanted it not to crash, right? But it's not always so obvious, especially with really weird UI bugs. You say, I wanted to do this, and they're like, that's what it's supposed to do. Or it did this when I wanted to do that. And it was like, well, it did what it was supposed to do. You're using the software wrong. I'm like, oh, I think your UI is wrong. But by explaining what you wanted to happen, and then also saying what did happen, it can help them tease out what is actually a bug and what is a UI problem and what is just a problem with their assumptions. Another thing that I found is hard for a lot of new contributors is just getting to know the community. I've worked in a lot of, since I was working on OpenStack, that was the most, corporate project I'd ever worked on. Almost everyone there is being paid by an employer to do the job. And this was very new to me. I'd been working on a lot of hobbyist projects, and even Ubuntu, which had a lot of employees, there was also a lot of community members. But when I started working with a lot more people who were being paid to do open source, they wanted to write code and be gone. They never came into chat, they never talked on the mailing lists, they didn't come to meetings, they just submitted patches. And that is certainly one way to engage with an open source project. But it's not a way to fully engage or build your career around this. People may vaguely know your name from some patches, but actually joining the chat and getting on the mailing lists, joining the project meetings, you get to know people, your code gets reviewed faster, you get invited to things, like we have an OpenStack, we had an OpenStack summit, you get invited to give talks and share your knowledge, and it's a huge boost for your careers, actually getting involved and getting to know these people. And on a more personal level, there are people in open source communities who I met working on Debian, who then I met again working in OpenStack, and then now in the containerization space, I see them again. You end up with these really like multi-decade relationships with people once you get to know people in your project. I've been away from OpenStack for about 18 months now, but I'm going to a project in a couple of weeks where we're all kind of getting the band back together. And the topic of the conference doesn't even matter as much to me as the personal relationships that I have with those people. I'm like, wow, we're all working on similar things again, and we can all get together and make this really amazing thing. And that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't joining project meetings and I wasn't going up to meetups and conferences and visiting with people and getting to know them. So even though code contributions and writing bug reports, all that stuff is engaging and good, but getting to know people on a personal level and engaging with them in things like chat and mailing lists is really helpful to your career. So I think I've got a couple of minutes left for questions. If anyone has any. I wanted to leave time for questions because, yep, go ahead.
How do you deal with people who are difficult to deal with in your community?
How do you deal with people who are difficult in your community? So it depends on what your role in the project is. If you're a newcomer and someone's being mean to you, you should probably look and see if there are etiquette guidelines or a code of conduct and what the escalation procedure is. I mean, most people just walk away, and that's really sad. But if you want to hang out and be like, listen, like I joined, you use that escalation mechanism and say like, I joined this project and someone's treating me unfairly. And then you go to whoever to report that. And I strongly encourage people to do that. I've been on the governing council of a couple of projects, and I would never, I want newcomers to tell me that because that's something I don't see. If you're further up in the project, it gets harder. As someone on the governing body, that's like the hardest job, is talking to people and being like, you're being mean, cut it out. But what happens at that level, or even if you're just an established member of the project, is you want to find a mediator and sit down with that person who's being mean, or find the mediator to talk to that person. Because usually what happens in these cases, some people are really just mean and they need to leave the project. But most of the time, the people you encounter who are acting poorly, they had a bad day, or their dog died, or they're really stressed out. And when you sit down and talk to them, or it's a misunderstanding, because some people, emotions are not really carried well online. So people can brush you off, what it seems like, and they're just, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be short with you. I was just really busy and threw off that email, and I didn't mean it to come off like it did. So really, honestly, just talking it out is how you get to the bottom of most of these issues in the community. Other questions? Yep.
What have you found works for you in growing your open source communities?
All right, so the question is, what works for growing open source communities? So the biggest one is having really, really amazing getting involved documentation so that it's super easy for people to get involved. Because once they're involved, then you have them, and then you can build their involvement from there. But most people go to the website and they're like I'll actually tease Apache Mesos for this for a minute. In order to contribute code, they have this little easy mechanism that's like, if it's something really simple, you can just submit it on GitHub. But we don't really use GitHub. Like, we actually use Review Board, and the instructions for contributing are like this long. And I tried to go through them last week, and I was like, I'm not doing this. And I'm paid to do it. So they do have instructions, but they're very complicated. So like simplifying instructions is a really big thing. Another one is going out to your community with specific tasks in mind. So I work on DCOS, and it used to be proprietary, so it was open source last year, but we still don't have very much of a community of contributors because it was proprietary and because a lot of the development is still not super open, much to my frustration. But we do want people to contribute. So what we do is we've thrown out some very specific bugs that have like, we need this to be fixed, or we want to update this example for the latest version of the software. And we had tremendous response to that, is when people see a task, they have instructions on how to accomplish it, and then they can actually contribute, and sometimes sending stickers helps. But giving them specific tasks, instead of like, here are all the ways you can contribute, just like saying, if you want, you can find your own way, but here is a very clear path of something you can do. And that's been really valuable to us. That's like been the key to us growing in the DCOS community. And generally just being friendly and like being on chat and responding to messages on the mailing list, and make it so people want to be there. So, yeah.
Do you have recommendations for some young open source projects to start working on?
Yeah, recommendations for young open source projects to start working on. I actually don't have any recommendations specifically, but what I would say is find something that you're using or that you're interested in, and then just look and see how active the project is, and then see if there's a way you can get in. I will also say some of the established projects, they have really, if you look at something like Ubuntu, which is huge, right? And that's obviously not a code base you really want to dig into as a newcomer, but there's tons of like satellite projects in that community, so there's lots of other things that you can work on. So I work on the Ubuntu project, which is like a flavor of Ubuntu, so we sort of use the same release mechanisms and hosting as a regular Ubuntu, but like we're kind of off on our own. I think the team's like 10 people, so it feels like a really small project, even though we get to take advantage of all the stuff and all the contribution workflows and everything of the big project. So big projects can also have really great experiences for newcomers. So I should probably just get a list of ones that I really like. OpenHatch. I don't think OpenHatch is active anymore. I would have recommended them. OpenHatch was a project that a bunch of people got together, and they were trying to like create a centralized place for all the easy tasks across a bunch of projects. So they were trying to help newcomers get involved with a bunch of projects, but I think most of the volunteers for that have gone separate ways. So, all right, thank you.